Just want to welcome everyone back to our second video. We started with this introduction last week and talked about this project Devin had mentioned about how to study the Bible. I convinced Devin to produce this for the entire church, and I'm thankful for that. I'm glad. Devin, how are you today? It's good to see you, my man.
I'm doing good, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well, doing good, just rocking along. But
I hear you.
noticing my shirt's a little tighter from the coronavirus quarantine
Right.
that's going on, but
That's
that's
okay.
all.
That's everybody. It's okay.
Everybody in my family's losing weight but me, but I know y'all want to hear that, but there we go. I'm just making up for their lack of calorie consumption, but it's good to see you, man. It's good to be able to come and provide this material to people out there in virtual world, church members and other folks alike, and hope you could share this with others if they are interested in learning more about how to study the Bible. We will say that studying the Bible and getting to the meaning of the Bible is difficult. We've got, churches with different names across the world. As you look at the proliferation of denominational groups, and people interpret the Bible differently. They look at the Bible differently. People even within the same church. Devin, I've got I know y'all can't see it, but I have two bookcases full of books on how to interpret the Bible. Why is it so hard to interpret the Bible?
Well, like you said, it is a cause of a lot of division. It's also something that a lot of what I've heard personally, a lot of atheists will bring up as why Christianity isn't a smart or logical thing to even follow, because, oh, look, you have so many interpretations and there's so much division in your church, even though you don't teach those sort of things. So it's something that's actually really important, and it's important that we get it right. And I think there are not by any means do I have the answers to all these issues, but I would like to at least walk us through the interpretation process. But I think there's a reason why it's so difficult. I'm going to share my screen here for a second, just one, so you don't have to see mine and Chris's face the whole time, but two, so you can, sometimes it's easier seeing words versus somebody just speaking. So we've got how to study the Bible here. We're going to specifically be talking about exegesis and hermeneutics, and I'm going to get into those a little bit more specifically and what the difference is between the two. But let's first just talk about what makes interpretation so difficult, and maybe it could possibly be narrowed down to these 5 things. One, it's due to our outsider status. I am a male. I'm a white male. I live in America in the year 2020. Genesis was not written necessarily with me in mind. It was not written so Devin can better live his life. It was written in a very specific situation. Moses writes this book in a very specific situation for the nation of Israel. So while it may be profitable for me, like we talked about in our last video, that Old Testament scripture is profitable for us, it's useful for teaching and correction, it may not answer every single issue I have in my life, because it's written for a specific situation in time. Another problem that we run into is the language. We don't speak Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. I like to pretend I speak Greek. I like to say Greek words so I sound smart sometimes, because maybe I'm just insecure about that. But whatever the case, we don't speak the same language. And if we are trying to read a translation of scripture, we're oftentimes going to get confused in the message and what's trying to be spoken about. So for instance, in 1 Timothy 2:12 is a scripture often referred to for the authority of males in church. And we're not going to get into that whole discussion right now, but it's interesting to note that one word being used for authority over women is the only time that word is used in the New Testament and all of Greek literature. We don't know what that word means as far as context goes. That's why there's so much division when it comes to interpretation. So it's hard to just use that one scripture to form any argument on the case. You have to go to other points in scripture. We have another issue when we come to our history. We are 3,500 to 2,000 years removed from the original writing. This kind of plays into our outsider status a little bit. But as far as medicine science, democracy, economy, transportation, and even religious traditions have definitely changed over the past 35 to 2,000 years, 3,500 to 2,000 years. Fourth, we have cultural assumptions. Our ways of, a very American way of looking at things is that new is good. The new thing is always the best thing. As soon as the new iPhone comes out, so, we've got a whole group of people that's going to immediately buy that new iPhone, even if their phone works perfectly. The fact that the new one has come out, I want the new one. Our ways of novelty is best is not the way people have always thought. For instance, back then too, religion and politics were heavily entwined in Jesus's time and going further back. But for us, we really stand on separation of church and state. So we have to understand that these cultural assumptions, things that we might read into the text that aren't actually there. Households and societies had a hierarchy to them, and especially a patriarchy to them. And so when we read scripture, keeping these things in mind and not reading in the way I grew up and the things that I know about society, we can get into a lot of trouble reading into scripture our own assumptions about society and the culture that surrounds us. And I think fifthly, there's this idea of differences in reader perspective. There's a really cool quote I'm going to read. The root of our deepest division is not lack of evidence. It is the fact of opposed horizons, and above all, irreducibly opposed horizons. And pretty much what that means, I find this anytime I talk to an atheist, I could provide what I consider evidence for God, but they don't consider it evidence most of the time. And it's not due to me not bringing in good evidence. It's that we have two opposing worldviews. Oftentimes, the atheist lives in a worldview of materialism, and that only what is in front of them is real. Only what they can touch and see and hold is real. I, on the other hand, would hold that things that you cannot touch and hold are real, like logic. And so we have opposing world views. We have to understand that our perspective of the world, of everything around us, we are quite removed from the people we are reading about in Scripture. We all come from different backgrounds socially, economically, politically, religiously, and ethnically. And so we have to keep all those things in mind when we interpret Scripture. And the difficulty comes in when other people don't keep those things in mind, or when we ourselves in reading of Scripture don't keep it in mind. Does that all kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think those are great. To put it in those 5 categories, I think that's a really good comprehensive list you've got. And as I think about those specifically, I mean, as you're talking, I'm just thinking of example after example of where what you're saying is so true. We're outsiders historically, so we got to be time travelers, so to speak, when we go to read the text. Makes it exciting. I'm going back to the ancient world. I always have this quote. I don't always have this quote, but I have this quote where I say, channel your inner first century Jew. Channel your Second Temple Judaism Jew. Channel your ancient Israelite mindset. And what I mean by that is try to go back and think like they thought. And that's where the tools of what we're going to talk about, exegesis, comes to bear, like knowing the historical background, knowing the culture. I can't help but think of things that we have against us, like the bias that we have against us right now is we're Western individualistic people. So we have a hard time understanding Paul. So much of Paul, and this gets back to the language. This gets back to knowing the original languages and also the old King James Version, which I'm not making a case for the King James Bible. I love a lot of the King James Bible, but I'm not saying King James only here. But the beauty of the King James Version was a lot of times when Paul would talk to churches, he's talking to ye, y'all, multiple people language. So a lot of passages that we've made these individualistic passages, it's about me and my salvation off on a hill somewhere reading my Bible, having alone time, is communal language. It's spoken to a community of people, and it's y'all, you all.
Right.
So we miss that. Um, I'm taking Hebrew right now, and we've learned that there's like debates, like where it says God walked through the garden in the cool of the day after Adam and Eve had sinned. They're hiding from God, and they're like, this is kind of weird. They're hiding. They've sinned. God's kind of just moseying through the garden. It's all good and nice and sweet, and the wind's blowing and the birds are chirping. And he goes, "Oh, Adam, where are you, buddy?" And in the Hebrew, there's debate where they think actually it's in the storm of the day. Like God comes storming into the garden. Like it is like this rushing wind that comes in the garden, and they're afraid because God is, let's just say he's got wrath because they've sinned. So it adds perspective when you know the languages and you know the culture, and you put your bias on hold for just a second and go, how did they hear this? And speaking of atheists, Christians get beat up a lot because technically when I run into atheists, they're not theologians. There's the exception like Bart Ehrman, who I don't know if he's really an atheist or an agnostic or what he is, but he's a pretty high-flying Bible scholar, and he'll be honest at times. He'll talk about the weaknesses of his argument, but most atheists, they're not theologians at all, and they don't know the text really well. They know enough to be dangerous. So they'll throw out, well, the Old Testament endorses slavery. And so we had this problem of anachronistically, the mistake of anachronism, taking a 21st century understanding and imposing it on a, 2nd century BC or, 1500 BC text. And slavery back then was much different in the Old Testament.
That's often dismissed, but that's a good, I mean, it's a good argument.
It's a really good argument.
It's not even a good argument. It's just, it's fact. That's what it was. But they often say, oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Well, no, it really does matter.
It's not race-based.
It matters how they looked at slavery.
Yeah. It's not race-based slavery, which was horrific. Yeah. What happened in the colonial America. I mean, that was indefensible and evil and horrible. That was not the case in the Old Testament. I read one Old Testament scholar, and he said it would be more like employment and with a lot more rules and a lot more regulations to your life, but it would not be like we think of slavery. It's radically different. So when you read in, and my point in saying all that was when you read into our understanding of a term or a concept in the 21st century, and you impose that back on the Bible, you're gonna make some major mistakes. So I'm excited. What we're gonna do here is try to give people the tools to time travel back to that time. What did the author intend? How did the audience hear it? What did it mean to them? And then carrying that forward eventually, what does that mean to us? So good. I like all 5 of those. Those are excellent.
Good. Well, let's continue our talk here a little bit. I'll go back to sharing my screen so that you can see what I'm thinking about as we go through this. So now that we have difficulty, a question that has to be asked is, where can meaning really be found? And I don't know that, I mean, that might just sound like the most abstract kind of thing, but there's really 3 ways that we can, when reading a text, find meaning. I could read a text and try to understand what the original writer was trying to say. If I receive a letter from a friend, well, let's say someone is sending a letter to me, but Chris intercepts the letter and he opens it up and starts reading. Well, let's say that they started referencing when we played football together. And Chris immediately, with his football background, is picturing high school stadiums and his experience with football. But what he doesn't know is that me and the author played flag football together, and we played it with a youth group. His assumption of what's going on, he did not approach this and try to find meaning in what the author meant. He tried to find meaning through his experience and how it applies to him. Okay. So that's 2 of the big ways that we find meaning. When you open up a text and you read it, you can either look for what the author was originally trying to say, or you're going to try to read the text and how it directly, immediately applies to you. And then there's a third option, which is kind of the median option that lies between these 2 extremes, of that the text has meaning. And despite what the author may have meant, and despite what it could ever mean to me, words have specific meaning, and I shouldn't look at any other options there. So I won't get too deep into that, but let's just keep those three options on the table, and let's try to figure out where meaning should really be looked for. So the two processes, again, that we're kind of talking about are exegesis and hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is really the umbrella term that exegesis falls under. Let's say hermeneutics are my method of how to interpret the Bible. And so there are a lot of different hermeneutics that could be employed or used to interpret Scripture. When we talk about exegesis, I'm talking about a specific method. And this method is various steps, depending on who you ask. It could be 3 or 4, or it could be as many as 20 different steps you take in trying to understand what the text is saying. So I'm going to define these two terms a little bit. And what I want us to focus on is exegesis. The next several videos that we actually get into, I think it's videos like, this is our second video, right? Second video that we're doing. Second. So our 6th through our 9th videos in this series are going to be completely devoted to exegetical steps or methods of exegesis. And what exegesis is, all that it really means is to lead forth or to draw out. So when I am reading a text, I'm trying to draw out its original meaning. I'm not, the opposite of that would be, I'm not reading meaning into the text. I'm going to try to figure out what the text meant. And so when we use exegesis, it involves looking at Scripture and analyzing the text. It pertains mostly, there's 2 ways to look at this. Well, one way to define this. Exegesis is looking at what the text meant, when often hermeneutics implies what the text means. And so hermeneutics often looks at, how do I appropriate the text to me in my situation? Where exegesis doesn't really care so much about how it applies to a specific individual or even the reader. It's more concerned with what the author originally intended. And that is, for me personally, what I most care about when I read Scripture. Because when I can find out the fundamental truth behind the text, I can then move on to see, well, does this actually apply to me in my situation? Does that make sense, Chris?
It does, and it takes a lot of wisdom. I think you've made a good point. And one thing I would point out, being a minister and being involved in church work a lot of people circumvent exegesis and go straight to application.
Yes.
They jump, they leapfrog. They won't really spend the time with exegesis and go, okay, what does this passage really mean? What does the author intend? How did the audience read this? What does it mean? Literally, the text. And they jump straight to, they don't even do that, and they go right to, well, how do I feel about this? And I think, and you may be going to get to this and talk about this, but one problem is the air we breathe is postmodernity. We're living in a postmodern society. So, we've been told all this time, like, we can't be confident of the meaning of a text. We can't be confident of absolute truth. Mm-hmm. You've got these guys, these French philosophers that came along that shaped late 20th century, early 21st century thinking. And it's suspicion of anything that claims to be true, a suspicion of tradition, like everything new is better.
Yeah.
That a text, it really doesn't matter what the author meant, but what does it mean to me? And I love Ravi Zacharias and how he handles this issue of truth. We know logically, just from our own experience, truth is truth. For example, if you asked me and you said, well, I heard you guys are having a baby, which that's not happening, by the way, but you guys are having a baby. And I said, yes, we're having a baby. Allison's pregnant. We're excited. This is great. Then you asked Allison and she'd be, no, we're not having a baby. That's crazy. That's ridiculous. You wouldn't walk away and go, man, I feel really good about that. That's her truth and his truth. And that's right. How they interpreted the data. And I'm good with that. You go, wait a minute. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. Zacharias talks about, he goes to the Wexner Center, and I think it's Ohio State, where they built this postmodern building. And there's doors opening to nowhere, windows that open up to walls. It's just ridiculous how it's built. And Zacharias asked a very pointed question to the guide. He said, let me ask you this. He said, I see you built this postmodern structure. Did they build the foundation that way? And his point was the building wouldn't stand without a true foundation. So exegesis is getting back to truth. What did the author mean? What does the text mean? Exegesis, I think this is so important to give people these tools of how to strip away the layers of years and all these barriers and find out what does the Bible say actually. And we can know truth. There's this science called epistemology, which is how do we know things? How do we attain knowledge? And boy, there's a huge debate going on right now. Can we truly know anything? Which is ridiculous when you think about it. But we can know truth. As Christians, we accept that the Bible does give truth and we can find it.
Right.
So I love what you've said here. The quote was awesome.
Good. And that, I hope for everybody watching that's clear what the intent of this video is to show you what the rest of this process is going to be. It's us looking at different methods or different hermeneutics, but really focusing on exegesis as our primary method to interpret scripture properly. Because what exegesis is going to do for us is take us to the author's intent. What did Matthew, Mark, Luke, Paul, James, what did they really mean when they wrote those words? Not what do I get from it when I read it? Because that's going to lead us to a million different interpretations. But if we could all move towards what they really meant, and even if you take the stance that, well, I can never be in the consciousness of that author, so I can never know the true meaning. Well, maybe that's true, but I think we could all move closer to what that intention was. We can be more right than more wrong. You know what I mean? That is a scale that we can move up and down. And even if you make the argument, we can never know what somebody's thinking. Well, if we all study this, we could probably move closer to what the truth really is. I, on the other hand, which we'll get into next week, believe in the inspiration of Scripture, and we will talk about what that means. And so I believe that we can find the author's intent. We can find out what he truly is trying to tell us in this text. And that leads me to the second point that has to be made. Just because we're focusing on authorial intent, what the author means, does not mean that it's not important to then apply the text to ourselves. That step, if you are a Christian, that step has to happen. I cannot unemotionally approach the text because the text forms and transforms who I am as the individual. So just because I'm saying, hey, we're focusing on the author, doesn't mean that we're not involved in the process as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Contextualization, I think, is the high-tech word they use for taking exegesis. You may correct me, Devin, if I'm wrong, but you take exegesis and apply it into our context of the 21st century. So you take the tools, what you're going to go through, these tools of exegesis, then we bring them to the 21st century and go, okay, how does this look like today? Does it apply to me? And here's some legitimate questions churches even ask. And we're divided across Christendom on this one in some respects. But when Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, does that become an ordinance for the church that we should do that? Should we greet one another with a holy kiss? Should women be veiled in our worship services? Should we have just one cup for communion in our own heritage? That's been an argument. Does it matter, the elements? Should it be the blood of the grape, the fruit of the vine? And should it be unleavened bread or leavened bread? There you get into exegesis. Does it matter if it's just bread? Yeah. So these are legitimate concerns. Some of these are simpler than others, but you can see where the rubber hits the road because we can get back to the original author and go, well, Jesus really did wash their feet. He did. Mm-hmm. He really did say, do this to one another. As I've shown you to do, as I've done this to you, do this to one another. Now the question comes, does that mean in the 21st century churches should be doing that? So I love how you put that together and phrase it.
And it has real world, it has right now application, right? So let's say I open up to Philippians 4:13. That's an easy one to go to. Something I think we could all quote if we wanted to. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Well, if I just take that verse and I try to make right now application to me, well, what that tells me is I can do anything. Often that's applied to sports teams or people who are in athletic competitions. They'll say, oh, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. They'll tattoo it. They'll put it up as banners. And they say, because of that verse, I can win this football game. But I promise you, that's not what Paul had in mind when he wrote the words. In context, even, if we just look at just what the words mean, we're going to find that it has to do with being content in our circumstances. No matter if I'm in awful conditions, I can get through it because I can do all things through Jesus. And so we can see that's where authorial intent and then me trying to make a direct, immediate application can really, go bad for us.
Wasn't Paul in prison too when he said that?
Yeah.
He was not running a 100-meter race or
right. I don't think he's thinking about football.
Tackling a running back, it was
right.
He was in prison. And there's another place too. We talked about this. Okay, how does this look and why does this matter? Okay, why? Someone may ask, well, Devin, why do I need exegetical tools? And there we could go through, like you've given one great example of what did Paul mean by that. We're misusing that verse. Other places like 2 Peter chapter 2, if you go around verse 10 and start reading through that, you're going to get this myriad of words that Peter's using to describe the situation. And just in the intramural discussions of Bible scholars, they argued, why was Peter switching his words up so much here? And they've come to realize that it's actually a speech. He's written this as a speech, and it has this oral flow to it. And he's alliterating. He's using the same beginning letter and sounds of all these Greek words.
Yeah.
And so he's just like we do in our sermons. I may give 3 points on Sunday. People joke with me. They're trying to guess what my third point is before I get to it,
right.
Because I alliterate a lot of times. But Peter's alliterating. So there's really no theological reason he uses all these different terms. It just sounds better. Mm-hmm. They all mean the same thing. He's trying to get the same point across. He's not trying to if people would chase that and go, man, Peter must be taking this deeper to another level. No, he's just trying to sound it out.
Yeah. So in both of those examples, not using exegesis can lead to confusion, and confusion can lead to division. And so that's why, for me, it is so important that as ministers, we teach about the proper way to study Scripture. And it's not that we're trying to be hard-nosed, and it's not that we're trying to say everybody else is wrong and I have all the answers. It's about, no, there's something that was decided outside of me. I didn't come up with the rules. I didn't come up with the exegetical process. It's a lot of people constantly refining this and saying, okay, this is leading us closer to truth. This is leading us closer to what Scripture means for the Christian. And that's why I think it's so important. So hopefully all of that made sense, Chris. That's pretty much the extent of what I think we're going to cover today.
Yeah, that was good stuff, Devin. I'm once again thankful for this material, your ideas, how you've laid this out. It's excellent. And people will be blessed, I believe, if they will stay with us and keep going through these videos. They're going to learn some tools that sometimes takes people years to learn. Mm-hmm. They're going to be encapsulated in these videos. So
I hope so. And I really want people, when you see this video, I'm sure you know how to contact either Chris or myself. Make sure you do that. And if you've got real questions, if you've got even examples of verses that cause confusion for you, make sure you send those to us and we will discuss them in these videos. Yeah. We'd be more than happy to do that.
We can do bonus videos with exegetical issues.
Easy. Done.
Right now we got a little time to do this stuff. So
right.
Devin, thank you, buddy. I appreciate you, man.
Thank you, Chris.
God bless you.